As we found a couple of years ago, industrial safety. That was something that we had not set out, but it turns out that performance, both cognitive and physical, has bearing on daily life, not just in athletics. And in some ways, it's even more grueling, more challenging if you're doing physically demanding occupations and work.
Welcome back to the Fitt Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Veneri. Today I'm joined by Roozbeh Ghaffari, co-founder and CEO of Epicore Biosystems. In this episode, we discuss Epicore's sweat sensing technology. Roos explains how the company's hydration monitoring platform evolved through partnerships with Gatorade and PepsiCo, and why they're expanding to support industrial athletes. Plus, we talk about biomarker innovation, moving beyond wearables, and building a personalized health platform. Let's get into it. The Fitt Insider Podcast is presented by EGYM. EGYM's smart fitness ecosystem is transforming healthcare through exercise. Combining strength equipment with AI-powered software and corporate wellness platform WellPass, it's leading the shift to proactive preventative health. Learn more about EGYM's intelligent workout solutions at egym.com. Hi, Roos. Welcome to Fitt Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. And to get things started, maybe for folks who aren't familiar, could you just introduce yourself and tell us about Epicore?
I'm Roozbeh Ghaffari. I'm CEO, co-founder of Epicore Biosystems. Background is mostly on the biomedical engineering side, and founded Epicore about 7-8 years ago now in 2017 with a group of team members as a spin out of Northwestern University.
In terms of the actual product, maybe, 7-8 years, I'm sure some things have changed, but that insight or idea that you set out to tackle and then going about building a product and a platform to do that, what does it look like today? Maybe how has that changed over this period?
Yeah, early on, when we were just getting things off the ground, we saw immediate need around fitness and performance as sort of a key target. There was just a lot of inbound. We had published some papers that caught the attention of various researchers out there in the hydration space, as well as even industry companies in the food and beverage, sports, as well as even apparel. And we knew there was something there. And if you sort of look over the years, we've done a lot in the sports fitness space in partnership with PepsiCo and Gatorade, for one. As you sort of look at the evolution, there's just been a lot more inbound and interest discussions around how do we expand out to thinking about overall wellness, nutrition, and even as we found a couple of years ago, industrial safety. That was something that we had not set out, but it turns out that performance, both cognitive and physical, has bearing on daily life, not just in athletics. And in some ways, it's even more grueling, more challenging if you're doing physically demanding occupations and work. And I think that's really been interesting. We wouldn't have predicted that from day one. It evolved over time, and our customers, mostly on the enterprise side and teams, have also, evolved to include the broader scope.
In the last, call it 3 to 5 years, like this hydration, sodium, electrolytes, mixes, powders, like there's so much on this input side. Like, what are you drinking? What are you putting in your body? And there's not a whole lot of conversation outside of, in my experience, like maybe college athletics, certainly pros, where it's like, okay, what's the sweat rate and how much you actually losing and weighing in and understanding that. So in this landscape of maybe obsessing over hydration, how do we get to that place where like there is a void in terms of like, what does that actually mean? How do we measure it? And then how do we act on it?
It all starts, and it usually does, with a lot of work that happens in laboratory settings where learn things. And sports lab, our predicate, our go-to for understanding what has been done. And there's a number of examples of that where, you could look to publications and the type of data that's being collected. It's a Gatorade Sports Science Institute team. There's groups out of UConn and elsewhere that have done a lot of legwork to really unlock understanding in this area of hydration and the broader scope. For us, it really started with, understanding that we can build tools that could start to measure these things in the simplest ways possible. Now, with sweating, athletics and workers, they tend to sweat. So you're able to kind of tap in and measure, almost exploit the fact that they are sweating. And what that has in turn done for Epicore and a group of other companies and research labs out there is it started to, in a non-invasive way, give us a window into what's happening underneath. And really, that's the big paradigm here. It's the closest example to this is continuous glucose monitoring, where you've been able to kind of look underneath the underpinning metabolic health. And that took decades for it to really take off. And Abbott and Dexcom and others have done a lot. It's expanded into more of a consumer realm these days. But really validating getting the measurements, whether it's sweat rate and sodium together, or how do we think about lactate? How do we think about creatinine in your sweat? These are all really interesting biomarkers and questions that we're after. And to make this ubiquitous, as a core technology, it has to be very simple, and the knowledge base has to really grow. And I think we are where HRV and heart rate and step counting were in 2010. We're really educating the population. You guys are, in a way, just by providing coverage of the various things happening, also helping. But as it relates to what happens, simplicity is key. You have to build solutions that you could use passively in certain cases, and also be able to showcase data in a way that's, digestible, so you could do something about it.
The CGM space, if you think about now how it's starting to evolve, there's obviously device manufacturers, there's other IP, there's software, there's algorithms, there's where's that being integrated. And I think maybe some people might be most familiar with Epicore because of like the Gatorade partnership, right? Doing the sweat patch. But just what does that portfolio look like? So what are you creating? And then like how do those maybe partnerships take shape so that this is where and how Epicore is showing up?
Yeah. So mm, we think of it like a continuum. So there's different use cases for different needs, and we learn this more or less the hard way or organically. We found that introducing another Fitbit like device or an Apple Watch directly into certain markets where they just want speedy, low touch, simple answers may not apply. So you can't, expect someone to divvy up $150 and, get a battery, a charger, all the rest. So we found that, providing snapshots in time provides a really interesting lo-fi, simple solution for a certain demographic of the marketplace. And as you sort of look across the spectrum, there is absolutely a need for that second by second real time data with haptics and feedback, richness of data that goes to the cloud. All of this is brand new data streams that I think, as you start to think about how does this look when you see sweat loss, sodium compared to skin temperature, heart rate, like there's a lot of very interesting metrics. And I haven't even touched on like cortisol levels and your kidney function biomarkers. And so for me, it's really landing and expanding across the entire spectrum, because sweat sensing, we think, has certain attributes. It's not all just one single sensing mode. I think you have to craft the solution to have biophysical measurements like skin temperature and motion to get that contextual information all in one. And so for us, it's been sort of a great learning experience to see what inroads in the market demand some of these more sophisticated data rich metrics, and then who just wants to get a measurement and then just be done and not have to worry about, I got another device to charge up next to my bed. So our solution has been to work with big enterprises to really decode and figure out where the fits and the gatekeepers are.
In some ways, we don't have certainly don't have all the data that we could, right? In terms of whether it's continuous or what's going on in our bodies. But in other ways, we have too many devices, too much data that we already aren't sure what to do with it. When you think about developing the different solutions and maybe it's through partnerships and those sorts of things, like Is there a world where we move towards a place where, there's one device to rule them all, right? Could some wearables integrate the type of hydration sensing that you're talking about, or is it more of like a one-off where it does need to be like a unique point kind of like solution that no, they can't replicate it? And then of course there's like the question of like IP and patents and like what they actually could and couldn't do.
There's certainly a real benefit to unifying as much as you can in certain applications. And we see that happening more and more so today as electronics continues to miniaturize even further and further. Battery power, generally trends up. So unification does happen, and it's been really interesting to see it. But there are certain chasms out there. And one of these chasms is being able to measure physical metrics like heart rate, like motion, like even blood pressure, for example, EEG. All of these are emanating signals that are coming out of your body. You don't need to worry about biochemistry when it comes to measuring them. But biochemistry is really hard. You can't just imagine, in certain cases, wiping the sensor down and putting it back on. It's been a challenge. That's one of the reasons why, glucose took so long. And then, adding new biometrics on top, validation is really the key word. It's to the truest sense, like clinically validating so that it's not just like a nice to have, not accurate type of thing takes time. And so I think there certainly is an evolution happening where, you could unify and bring things together. The challenge for that to happen like overnight or even, in short order is biochemistry and biophysical metrics as they are being measured are n- not very easily brought together into one. So you could sort of do it. And if I were to sort of map it out in time, I think it will happen. It needs to happen in such a way that drift and fouling of certain biochemical sensors are all addressed in a way that makes sense. Now, what is really key is there are low hanging fruit. So hydration, if you're looking at certain targets, you could do that maybe more readily. And I could certainly see that happening. We're working on it, and I think over time you could see things integrated and unified. But as you start to open up the aperture to other biomarkers, that's where it gets more challenging from the biochemical point of view.
The other thing I wanted to kind of circle back on was you mentioned this idea of the enterprise partnerships and not wanting to be in a position where it's like, hey, we created another device. And essentially, then what you become is like a marketing and customer acquisition engine, right? How do we spin this up? How do we compete relative to everybody else? What you mentioned a lot of potentially inbound also for these partnerships. Like when that does start to come together, is it just a matter of talking to them and saying, they're we have this particular problem, and you're like, okay, and you set out to see if you can solve it for them, and then you set out to work together? Like, how are those things structured in a way where it makes sense for you? And it's also not kind of starting back at ground zero every single time, right? So it's like starting from scratch to make it scalable and, and make it worth doing.
It didn't happen overnight, but as you build up the manufacturing capabilities, and we've built our products end to end, so we have the in-house knowledge to work with third-party manufacturers to understand and really internalize how to build the various classes of sweat sensors that we've been doing. And to your question around like how do you work with enterprises? Well, one key point to consider here is the end user is always going to be the consumer or the athlete, the worker. How we get there is through enterprise relationships, customer relationships. And what we found over the past year or so, and this is something that we're sort of acting upon now, is that there's a lot of really interesting data streams that are coming from the rings, from the wristbands, from various types of devices that are already out in the market. But, how do you layer in hydration into that? Well, one way to do it is through peripheral devices that maybe you pull in as needed based on your core device. And one example of that just happened in the news fairly recently is Aura and Dexcom. So Aura has their platform. It's the ring, provides you data. And as you sort of think about the Dexcom relationship, like there's a lot of really interesting feedback through a peripheral like the CGM for the Aura customer base. And I think as we think about what, especially in the snapshot, lo-fi, simple device mode, you could imagine that being a way to like tap into hydration with a simple device without having to add another battery operated device to your repertoire. So that's one way to think about it. But certainly, as I mentioned, there's also the more sophisticated continuous monitoring platform, which we call connected hydration. That device has the ability to collect a lot of data all in one. And there, the real draw with customers, enterprises is the feedback loop. They're able to put in drinks, they're able to collect data, not just about sweat, but skin temp, motion. And for them, it just provides a lot of that contextual data. In some cases, the first time some of these industries are seeing biometric data come in. So in that sense, it's really interesting to kind of see the response and the uptake there.
The fitness, sports, wellness, like a lot of that is like pretty obvious and can see where that lines up. I don't think it's maybe for this audience as obvious, like the need around industrial workers, you're out in the field, heat stroke, certain kidney diseases. Like, how do you think about those markets and what has the reception been like? What have the conversations been like kind of out there with partners thinking like, hey, how do we really do this from like a safety standpoint, not a performance standpoint?
First thing is when you think about the sports athletics market, there may be coaches, there may be players, individuals, very open to data access and being able to collect that information and be able to make sense of data across a population. We've seen this with teams. They're collecting information and data, and in some ways, it's even gamified. And you can see what you're doing versus someone else on the team, kind of like Orange Theory Fitness, having the various LCDs to compare and contrast. That's been a very powerful way to really educate people around hydration. What does it mean to lose sodium? A lot of people just think, oh, I could just drink water and I'll be okay, but that's not the case. You need electrolytes, and there's no other way to measure it unless you do a urinalysis test and other things in an easy way. Industrial worker market, and the customer base that we've grown, and we're actively working with about 60 enterprises, and that list is growing. It's basically think big corporations that are out there expanding. And that for us was, it all started with understanding the sports space, but then also learning what it means to work with big industrial companies. And so one key point to mention is as you think about cloud analytics data, there's a lot more infrastructure required to be able to enter into that market, because when we think about workers, these are big enterprises. You want to protect the workers, empower them. And so our default mode for a lot of the industrial applications is anonymized data at the cloud, and only the individual gets to see what they're doing. That's a default mode because we've seen that different places, different training, if you go to a firefighter academy school, for example, you want to see data. But in general, that has been a really powerful way to deploy the same class of sensors, but approaching it from the standpoint of empowering the individual worker. And we call these folks industrial athletes for a reason, because from a standpoint of losing fluids and sodium and skin temperatures, these guys are beast mode. They are working in 120 degrees Fahrenheit day in, day out, wearing PPE the same way that a linebacker would be wearing gear, if not more so. And we've just seen off the charts data with these populations. For a data scientist team here, it's just like an amazing riches of data that comes out. But in a lot of ways, it's much more extreme cases than what you may see. Now, there are cases in sports. We work with football players, hockey players, soccer players who are like pretty intense, but just the number of hours that some of these workers have to put in, huge respect. And also just, you sort of want to help them become more aware and, sort of unlock what up until now is just, you use a chart in the restroom that tells you about your pee, your urine color. And that's just not good enough.
This episode of the Fitt Insider Podcast is brought to you by EGYM. EGYM makes some of the most innovative strength training machines on the market, but that's only one part of their integrated ecosystem. With connected fitness equipment, AI-powered gym software, and a comprehensive corporate wellness offering, it's forging the future of preventative health. Partnering with companies worldwide, EGYM's WellPass program improves employee health by expanding access to premier fitness and health facilities. Upgrading gym floors, EGYM equips every operator with smart equipment and AI tools to create hyper-personalized training plans for every exerciser. Putting it all together, they're transforming healthcare through exercise. Experience the power of EGYM's ecosystem at egym.com. Previously, we've talked about like this idea of trickle down health, right? Where you see something that starts at elite athletics and then it gets introduced maybe to a consumer market. And in this case, even getting into these industrial athletes that can really have a huge impact in a place where, as we mentioned, like it's not even an afterthought because I don't even know that it was a thought to begin with. So it's just, not even top of mind. In sports, it's basically we're competing for every advantage. Everything is geared towards improving and winning, even if it's milliseconds, all those sorts of things. Is it how much more difficult or what is the reception like? How difficult is it to like kind of have these conversations, say like, hey, this really matters, and then proving it, like you talked about, like this is what it means if we implement it. This is where not only from a safety standpoint, are they worried about seeing productivity gains? Are they worried about seeing healthcare costs? Like what does that value proposition and conversation look like to really get it to a place where like this matters and then they'll implement it?
Yeah, I think one thing that has happened probably more so over the past 3 to 5 years than the previous decade is an awareness around extreme heat.
Yeah.
We've seen it based on the inbound we've received, based on just news coverage of the Olympics, of the World Cup, of just building out some of these stadiums and what it takes in various extreme heat environments. And so that awareness has gone up in the mainstream media quite a bit. I think that's helped. And like you said, there are sort of three key pillars. It's safety is one, so making sure that the individual person is safe and aware of their body as opposed to just like following an all in one type of regimen or routine. And that when we say that, everyone nods their heads. So health and safety, environment managers, executives, workers themselves, dietitians, hygienists, everyone understands that, we're all different. And I think the medical industry has helped elucidate that. Sports has also helped. It's, one size fits all just doesn't really do it. But the other two aspects that have also really come to the top are how do I think about productivity and what are certain costs associated with highly skilled personnel, your most important resource going down. And, you kind of see this across various industries where it's super important and really big kudos for the companies that are really pushing to address it. We've found that it's not just one sector, it's multiple. But really the starting point for us has been to tackle it where there is infrastructure, there is data knowledge, because you generally want to break into those areas space with a new category, a new product, and then educate and then build from there. And so working with big enterprises certainly has that advantage. It also overcomes any like regulatory or governmental things that usually are more glacial speeds of things happening. So, in my experience, it's always been great to work with the private sector to push. And then with government contracts, military, you can really help build on the momentum, but more from maybe on a pipeline R&D basis. And that's just sort of how we've done it. But it's been very sector specific around some of these very highly skilled workers to start.
And if you don't talk about the kind of actual split publicly, maybe the question is like, what's your ideal split? But how do you think about this, like performance, sports, fitness versus or not versus, but in comparison to this like enterprise and industrial kind of athlete market?
Both interesting for us, and we've sort of pushed both in parallel in a lot of ways. I think we organically started in the sports fitness realm, and that was in large part driven by the partnerships that we had with PepsiCo and Gatorade to start a lot of early studies. And I actually think the reverse probably would have been really challenging, if not impossible. Sports fitness really lends itself well to breaking things fast, innovating quickly. And, I think that was proven to be the case with the team we worked with at PepsiCo. We still work with them pretty closely. They have that startup mentality to really go out there and try new things out quickly, validating, which, what we're all about. And I think the industrial market's much more conservative in that light. Like they want to see things, they want to adopt, and, there's a lot of examples of where that's happened. But I think if we walk in with a prototype and haven't really, proven ourselves, it would have been much harder as a small fledgling company coming out of the gate. So that sequence probably wouldn't have happened in reverse, put it that way. It would have been a lot harder. And, if there's ever a retrospective, like I feel very strongly that, we were able to look at biomarkers, try things out, and there was no question about it. It's like sports fitness guys have that DNA to kind of look at it from that lens. Even the teams that we worked with, they were like medical folks, staff who want to try new things. Oh, what if we try like a new biomarker? There's just that appetite. With industrial sectors, I think in general, it's a lot more conservative.
I was asking in part one, because I was just curious, and two, because you guys announced 30 plus million in funding this year, which is awesome. And oftentimes when that happens, there's like some type of impetus, right? You kind of see something, you're like, oh, we have this opportunity. We need to have the capital to then go ahead and tackle it. Part of that, it sounds like, was building this like kind of connected platform, focusing on being able to secure the data that you're collecting. And you can tell me, was it something like, oh, we are now ramping up and seizing this opportunity more so in like the industrial athletes, or was it kind of just in general seeing the response and the market opportunity to go ahead and scale up in a way that, you get investors on board and excited about what you were going to do?
The key thrust behind our latest investment round was certainly the beachhead was how do we really go forward and scale our current connected platform and really get it out there. It's US certainly is where we've started, but there's a lot of uptake and interest in places like the Middle East, Asia, Australia. And so thinking about how you do that takes a little bit of effort, and having the support of really strong investors helps. But as we took a look at it, there's a whole different aspect to it that came to light, and that has to do with hydration is sort of the first vector biomarker target. And if you look at sweat, as I mentioned earlier, there's just a lot of different targets there. You guys published a story on creatine and how that's growing as a supplement for health, wellness, not just for energy and for weightlifting. Well, we know urea and creatinine are in sweat, and we can measure it, and it's there. It's quantifiable. We're actually publishing papers on it. We've published a couple already. And so when you start to open up and think about the possibilities, it starts to look like, you could start to add to the toolkit and expand. And as we started to look into that and publish papers on some of the other biomarkers with collaborators, we found that there's more or less a global health need for access, especially for our snapshot lo-fi solution. And that opened my eyes up because I've come from a background where, I've done some work in nonprofits and getting, low cost technology out there. When we took a look, we're going international. We've seen a lot of uptake here, North America, globally, but this tech has the ability to onboard new biomarkers. And that was really a really key pillar as we looked at scaling up the technology, but where does this go? And it's all about access. How do you get things to the people that need it most? One of our collaborators, I'll just mention, is at University of Illinois Chicago, and we've worked with them on some of the urea creatinine metrics. It turns out it's a really important target, not just for wellness, but even for more medical applications downstream. Just in our backyard, there are people who are asymptomatic for kidney issues. Where does it come from? Uh, Extreme heat, for one, various comorbidities don't help. And as we've started to expand and looked at some of these other biomarkers, it became clear that we have a platform and we want to sort of see that through. But, you got to get some wins. And so hydration's been really key in helping us do that.
I was actually going to, frame it through the lens of the focus. We talked about like the focus on performance in sports. We get that. And then the even wellness and hydration just moving more so into like the mainstream. But as you're talking about, and I think there's just like a huge gap when we talk about longevity and preventative health and overall well-being, hyper personalization and making sure that it is truly one of one is often talked about. And we talk about it so often through the lens of like blood tests, right? Now it's huge, right? Everybody wants to get you a blood diagnostic panel, and then AI is going to solve it in terms of like telling you what to do. But this creatine example, like the amount of people who take supplements that really have no idea, do they need them? What is it doing? What do I do with this information? Like, I guess the question is more so like, do you see this all even fitting into this ongoing conversation about like longevity, preventative health, like actually starting to bring clarity to an entire category, field, industry, really, like that is kind of like guess and check maybe, or like wants to be more personalized, but really doesn't have like these kind of tools yet to actually do it.
Yeah, I've followed a bit around the various types of blood tests out there now, and from one vantage point, I think the pandemic helped kind of catalyze a lot of what's happened. It sort of made at home tests and getting a measurement much more amenable to daily life. And I don't know if that would have happened at the pace that it did if not for the pandemic. But now that it has happened, you highlight a really key point. It's what tools do we have? Most of them happen to be blood-based tests, maybe a little saliva testing here and there. We haven't yet directly interfaced with that market. Like I personally see it, and we've kind of seen what's happening with the various companies, startups, big companies, middle-sized companies now doing it. But I do agree there is like an intersection point that will happen. And the real value is in, how do you make some of these tests real time or simpler so you're not like having to get a FedEx box and ship it. That is something that we're starting to kind of feel out a little bit from the standpoint of places where you're familiar with, exercise. Well, gyms, for example, that's one. Could be a really interesting avenue or routine that could be established around going to the gym versus even being at home. We're going to learn a lot from what works and what doesn't work from what's happening today as it relates to blood based sort of metrics. And generally speaking, everyone wants non-invasive. So that's something that we're driving on some of the real-time metrics. And as you start to see what's happening in that ecosystem around just getting a panel, and there, a lot of companies that are in the wearable space are starting to employ third-party labs to really build out the peripherals around. So I think it'll intersect when it happens. I think we're probably a couple of years away, and it's driven by familiarity, validation, and simplicity. How do you build it so that it follows? And again, I go back to hydration. That's one where there's decades of data, and we and others have really tried to push the envelope there.
And when it comes to now deploying this capital and continuing to scale up, is there anything that maybe we should look out for this year that you're particularly excited about or working on with the team, or like where's that focus now, and like what are those next couple either opportunities or hurdles that you're working on?
The team here, we're always working on the next thing, and whether it's biomarkers or looking at new instantiations of our existing products. I'm super excited about is with our connected hydration system. We have taken an approach where you use the solution and have like a patch form factor. You can wear it on different body locations. A lot of researchers like that flexibility, and we found that a lot of super users really like it too. You could kind of move it around and use it in different modes. But what we found, and this was came to light with a lot of the work that Whoop did. They did the whole Whoop body. We're rolling out new capabilities where you could actually take the same hardware and have it in an armband and use it either with the patch accessory or with the armband. And the benefits there are, you could use it sort of in a day-to-day kind of just not even think about it mode, but you could also flip the script and then, use it in a more of a, look, I want to wear a patch on my chest and collect data from this location. And we think there's advantages to having both capabilities with the same piece of hardware used for both. So look for that. That'll roll out this summer. It's something that we're piloting out, and it's just really excited about having the ability to cater to the needs of the different users from multiple angles. It'll be great to see. And then the second is always looking at different biomarkers and targets. We're doing a bit of work looking at some of the kidney biomarkers and more to come on that front. Always with us, it starts with publications and getting it out there with various customers, whether it's in the food and beverage domain or more broad. Those are active areas where we're super excited about. So you'll see some things happening over the next couple of months.
Perfect. Yeah, we will certainly be keeping tabs on everything that kind of rolls out. And for folks who want to do the same or check out more, follow along, where would you point them?
Yeah, Epicore Biosystems.com is, a website where there's a lot of this information there. And we also have a LinkedIn profile, Epicore Bio, where folks come to. But I think the website's probably the easiest place to look out for us.
Perfect. We will get everything linked up in the show notes, and super grateful for the time today. Excited to share the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you got value from the conversation, please consider subscribing and sharing the podcast with a friend or colleague. It's a massive help. And if you want more content like this, including news and insights on the latest industry developments, subscribe to the Fitt Insider newsletter at insider.fit.co. And one more thing, you can learn more about our recruiting and consulting services at fit.co. That's FITT.co. I'll see you here next week.